Morning. I'm sorry we are meeting like this.
Morning, sir.
I would have loved to interact, but then there are always constraints, right? So what we'll do today basically is we'll look at the basic concept of economy, because what we are studying is the economic environment. And as you know, every type of environment affects business. It can be social, it can be technology. Right now we are talking of economy, and as some of you must have read, because of this COVID part of it, a lot of economic things are going to happen in the next few months, which could be extended beyond a few years also, right? Have you got something from Deepak Parekh? He has mentioned something about his own understanding of the economic environment in India in the next few months. Okay, I'll send it over. See, basically, idea is that in business and in every walk of life, actually, economic environment matters. I mean, as for MBA, you know that your placement is going to depend upon the economic environment. If business is booming, nobody asks you about what package you want and why. But the business is not booming, even the package is impacted, as we call it. So right now, what we'll do is we'll talk about the basic concept of economy. Now, economy normally consists of what we call three segments or three sectors, which is known as, all of you know, agriculture, then industry, and then services. Okay. Now, typically, if you look at the various components of economy, and I'm talking about this basically because later on, we are going to talk of economic development, economic reforms, and various sectors, but all of them will be part of the economy. So I'm just touching upon this basic concept in the opening session. Okay. So broadly, if you could see from the presentation, you have something known as GDP, gross domestic product, then you got the gross national product, then you got net national product, then you got national income, per capita income. Then of course, as I said, the economy is developed because of three sectors, and the economy consists of three sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. So we also look at what is the contribution of each of these sectors to economy. As you know, some people wrongly consider India to be a agrarian economy even today. It is not so, because agriculture today contributes roughly about 20% of the industry, another 20% of GDP, and services sector today is actually contributing almost 60%. If we compare India earlier, you will find that agriculture was the mainstay, very few industries and services was not present really the way it is today. So what we have seen as part of economic development is we call the structural transformation. That is, you move from an agrarian, labor intensive, low capital, low technology economy to industry, where we start using capital, technology, and then we move to services, where we start using the, yes please, are you getting me?
Yes sir, please continue.
Okay, so as I was saying, as the economy starts developing, what we call state of economic development, there is what is known as structural transformation. That is, agriculture starts contributing relatively less, industry starts contributing more, capital intensive, technology, organized employment kind of thing, and then knowledge based, what we call services part of it, they start coming into picture. If you look at most of the developed economies that we talk about, say G7 or G20, USA, France, Germany, UK for that matter, you will find that the major contribution to GDP is coming from services sector. Relatively much insignificant contribution is from agriculture. So when we talk of economy, we consider what is the contribution of each sector to the economy, and then we arrive at some kind of judgment about the state of economic development, whether you are developing, whether you are development oriented, or you are a developed economy. Now, typically, if you look at the economic developed countries, as we call it, or economies, you will find that there are what we call certain basic parameters or indications, as we call it, or symptoms, if I may use, because we are talking of the COVID part of it. Basically, what happens is you will normally find that as the economy starts developing, you have a very strong R&D, and the technology is quite advanced. You will find, if I may add, and you are all aware, if you look at the patents, today you will find that most of the intellectual property rights are more with the developed countries than the developing country like ours. Even in India, if you look at the patents, you will find that it is the MNCs who are getting more patents filed than the Indian companies. And of course, as far as the state of technology is concerned, like, IT, for example, we are all into IT. But what happens is, we are only using the laptops which are manufactured abroad. We have not developed any of the hardware part of it. The chips, they come from Intel or maybe AMD. If you're looking at the operating systems, they are again mostly Microsoft. Then of course you can have others, but 70-75% Microsoft, right? So basically what happens, either the software or the hardware part of it is coming from the developed countries. You look at your cell phone, you look at the cars, like if you look at the cars in India, India is one of the major market for auto companies across the world. But can you name any company which is Indian? They are manufacturing in India, but the technology comes from Germany, it comes from Japan, it comes from South Korea, it comes from US. So basically the point is that as the economy starts developing, there's a very strong R&D, because of which you get latest or state-of-art technology, as you call it. And obviously, because you are having a better technology, the efficiency goes up, and most of the developed countries are relatively more productive. That is, the productivity ratio is much higher in the developed economies than the developing countries like ours. For example, if you look at the Indian banks, typically, you will find there are a lot of people, okay? Now, what happens is, you go abroad, you'll find very few people because whole thing is driven by technology. Automation, again, is part of it. Then you also have what is known as, like Ford, for example, they started assembly line. This is all part of technology, and obviously, they are more productive than what we have in developing countries like India. Then, of course, you have what is known as the role of private and public sector. If you remember, in India, till 1991, the major industrial financial activity was more into the public sector. If you talk of phones, it has to be BSNL or MTNL. If you talk of airlines, it had to be that time Indian Airlines or Air India. If it had to be steel, it has to be the government companies. If it had to be roads, it was always the PWD and CPWD. Relatively speaking, now you will find that telecom, I wonder how many of you actually have got a BSNL connection. Or, when you travel, I wonder how many of you travel by the state transport bus or the Air India, because Indian Airlines is now moved Air India. So typically what is happening now is that as you start developing, or a developed economy has a major contribution coming from the private sector and a relatively less contribution coming from public sector. You will also find that most of the developed countries, because they are economically developed, have got a very strong savings and investment. See, today, if I may just give an example, you will find that most of the FDI, foreign direct investment, that is coming to us is coming from abroad. Now, obviously, those people are investing and they are not taking a loan for investing in India. That basically comes because they have got substantial savings, which they don't have enough avenues, so they are coming to India. But the fact is that they are able to invest because they have got the surplus, and the surplus happens because of savings. So a highly developed economy normally, you will find, has got a very high range of savings, and therefore a very high rate of investment, as you call it. And obviously, if there's investment, it leads to capital formation, setting up of industries, setting up of multinational corporations, either in services or even R&D. For example, the seed companies like Monsanto or Cargill, for example, you need a lot of money for it. IT companies, you need money. Banks, you need money. As you must have seen, because Chinese companies have a lot of capital now, there are reports that they want to acquire companies from the Europe part of it. So basically, capital formation. In fact, if I may add, in economics, we have something known as a country is poor because it is poor. Now, why are you poor? You are poor because you don't have income. Why don't you have income? You don't have income because there are no jobs. Why there are no jobs? There are no industries. Why no industries? There's no investment. Why no investment? No capital formation. Why no capital formation? No savings. So no, this is known as the vicious cycle of poverty. And as part of economic development, what we want is we want to move away from this vicious cycle of poverty to what we call the virtuous cycle of prosperity. If I may add, this Pepsi, they have something like Dil Mange More. I always want more zeros on my income, right hand side, of course. I want a bigger car, a bigger house, those typical kind of thing. But that happens provided you got savings and you can invest in them. Then you'll also find that normally speaking, in a less developing economy, the income distribution is relatively more skewed. As skewed means, there's a dualism. Dualism means there are two extremes. Like, if I give you a very, visualization of example, you will find that in India, we got a person, who has got a house which is probably supposed to be one of the costliest residential property, costing about 3,000 rupees until I am talking about, okay, Bombay. Or, if you look at Bombay, you'll find, you go to Malabar Hill and Marine Lines and Govalia Tanks, Pedder Road, those kind of things, which are supposed to be one of the most prosperous, even by national standard in India. But at the same time, you will also find that in Bombay, we have got the biggest Jhopalpatti slum area globally. That means here is a country where you got a property which is probably the priciest property in the world, highest level, and at the lowest level, you got the biggest slum in the world. So that is known as two extremes, as you call it. Or another example, don't take it personally, but lightly. Today, there are people in India, and again, unfortunately or fortunately, Mukesh Ambani's name comes in. There are people like Mukesh Ambani who can, just afford to give an aircraft as a gift to his wife on his wife's birthday. I hope if you're a girl, you become wife like this, and if you're a boy, you become a husband like this. But typically, here is a situation where a husband can coolly afford to give an aircraft as a gift on his wife's birthday. While in majority of the country in India, you will find, particularly the rural and Mofussil area, there are people, young kids particularly, who look at the sky when an aircraft flies, because for them, that aircraft is always, what you call, if you remember that old English poem, up above the sky, twinkle, twinkle, little star kind of thing. So that is what we want, the dualism or skewed income distribution, and obviously, there's much of poverty. Like in India, what is known as below poverty line. Now, if 40% of the people are below poverty line, that means there's something wrong in the economy. Now, I'm not saying that there are no poor people in the developed countries. Let me tell you, personally, I have seen beggars in the New York State near the Central Library, which is supposed to be one of the better, Times Square, those the typical upmarket areas, as you call it. But I have seen beggars there also, but in India, every signal you'll always get beggars. Out there, they are rare. So the point I want to highlight is that the income distribution is skewed or dualistic, and there's a great incidence of poverty if economy is not developed. Then, of course, another point that I would like you to consider is what is known as infrastructure, the basics, like airports. Then you got railways. Then you got transportation. Like I remember. Hold up. Come again. You want me to continue, or you have got a good question?
Continue, sir. It was somebody else's mic. Please continue.
Okay, fine. So as I was saying, we are talking of infrastructure like roads, like railways, like say ports, or even airports, as you call it. And today you will find that because we are on the upwardly mobile path of development, like T2 terminal in Bombay and T3 in Delhi are supposed to be comparable to most of the relatively better airports. But trust me, and I've seen Pune airport developing. Earlier, Pune airport was having only one flight, because only basically it's Air Force, not much of what you call length of the runway. Today, when we used to actually, you not believe this, we used to call it Pune airport, and I'm talking of 70s, okay, 75, 76, 70, when I started flying for the first time. We used to call the Pune airport air-conditioned Swargate ST bus stand. It was that bad. Typical, the government off-white, brown color kind of thing. And there are no counters, no nothing, just two counters. You walk in, you actually walk up to the aircraft. We do that today also, but today you'll find, there's some kind of aero bridge. There's some kind of, you feel that you are at the airport rather than a ski bus stand. Then roads also today are relatively better. I remember, when Nitin Gadkari was the PWD minister in Maharashtra, in his chamber there was a board. The board read something like this: America is a rich country. America has good roads. And then, the next sentence was, America is a rich country because it has got good roads. See, today you will find, that in India also, relatively speaking, I am not comparing, let me be clear, I am not comparing with the autobahns in Germany or the super express highways in Australia or USA. But compared to what we have seen earlier, today the roads are definitely better. Like, a few years back, in fact, we have traveled to Bombay by road. It used to take at least 5 to 6 hours. You'll not believe this. Today, if anything more than 3 hours, I think it's a criminal. But that's part of infrastructure development. Airports is part of it. You go to know port-wise, if you have seen the old movies of Diwar, like Amitabh Bachchan, you will find that the whole port was full of coolies. Today, you go to a port like Paradip, or you go to port nearer to Bombay, what do you call JNPT, Jawaharlal Nehru, near Nhava Sheva port, and you will find, there are only automation. The truck comes with the containers. There are 6, what do you call, berths, and everything is done mechanically and automatically. There's a operator sitting. He comes down, picks it up magnetically, loads on, and the ship is out of the port within 24-hour turnaround time. Earlier, the ship used to stop or wait on the high seas for minimum 15 days. Think of it. So roads, railways, even railways, are much better today. So today, air conditioning is something that we take for granted. I remember, 73, I'm talking about 74, when I went to Delhi for my UPSC. For us, it was a thrill to travel by a train that was air conditioned. Rajdhani, I'm talking about. And of course, we were young. So we traveled from Bombay to Delhi in chair car for 18.5 hours. And we enjoyed it because, we had never seen something like that. A train, air conditioned, food and everything on the house, as you call it. So railways today are relatively better. Shatabdi, what do you call, Rajdhani Express, or there are a lot of varieties of those kind of things. So railways, airports, port, hard infrastructure, as you call it, that's the physical part of it. Okay. Then we also have what is known as soft or institutional infrastructure. See, like olden times, 69, not very far off, we had 8,000 commercial bank branches. Today we have almost 90,000 institutions. Life insurance, we are only one. Today we have almost 20 companies. Mutual funds, UTI. Today again, almost 15, 20 private sector also. Banks also private sector. And then you find, these banks, education institutes. I remember olden times, if you have to be engineer, the only way was get admission to either COEP or what you call UDCT Bombay or IITs. Today, or if you have to be MBAs, IIMs or Jamnalal, few things. Today you will find, the government post 1991 has created a beautiful infrastructure, both research, CSIR labs are part of it. There are private labs, there are educational institutes, private universities have come up. Then you have got n number of private medical engineering colleges, banks, insurance companies. All that is part of institutional infrastructure, because actually what they do is they provide the necessary inputs. And today, if you've got good manpower, it is thanks to the infrastructure institution of engineering colleges, MBAs, and university that we have. If you're talking of the financial system, relatively developed financial system in India now, thanks to the basic institutional infrastructure of banks, mutual funds, investment companies, insurance companies, all these go and constitute part of it. And developed countries have a lot of these kind of both physical as well as institutional infrastructure, which is a must if we are talking of an economic development or an economy that is developing over a period of time. Then, of course, as you find today, we always talk of made in USA or UK. In fact, olden times, you will find that USA, Germany, Japan, England, France, these were the countries who actually used to export, and most of the countries in Asia, Africa were always used to import something. We were exporting something, no doubt, but what were we exporting? We were never exporting technology-driven products or finished products. India's major exports, even today, if you leave aside the IT part of it, India is still known for export of tea, which is Darjeeling tea, basmati rice, some fruits, spices. You will find that all of them are basically what we call primary goods. There's not much of value addition. The trees or the plants give us tea, leaves, we only process and export it. There's no value addition kind of thing. But you will find that even today, although we are among the top 5 economies in the world, India's share in the world trade is not more than 2%. In fact, that is our goal by 2020, now extended, of course. As against that, you'll find, country like USA or Japan or Germany or UK used to count for a significant amount of percentage in the global trade. So as the economy develops, or as if the economy is a developed economy, the percentage share of that particular country's exports is significant higher, 17, 15, 20, 17. Like China today accounts for 70% today. That's part of it. So China is a major economic power because they got a substantial share in the global trade. And again, as I was saying, most of the underdeveloped or developing countries import technology-driven finished products, aircraft. Even your computers, they are not manufactured in India in the technical sense of the term. You always get Dell or Lenovo or Asus or Apple. They are not Indian. Core hardware is imported. Rice exported, yes. Spices exported, yes. But they are primary products. So economy, as we start developing, the imports become less and less of technology because you start developing your own steel, you start developing your own cars, you start developing your own machines. As against that, if you are not developed economy, you are basically exporting agro-based products. So that's one of the indicator of economic development. Okay, and then of course, the logical conclusion is if you are exporting more and importing less value-added products, you will have a surplus in what is known as balance of trade and balance of payment. Now there are two things I would like you to remember: balance of trade and balance of payment. Just basics, nothing great about it. Balance of trade is basically the difference between the physical import and export of physical goods, tangible goods as you call it. So, I export rice, I export tea, I export spices, I export mangoes or onions, and I import basically aircrafts, computers, machinery. So these are tangible products. Now, if I'm exporting more tangible products and importing less tangible products, my balance of trade will be surplus. So surplus is the difference. Now, BOP or balance of payment is a higher level which consists of both the tangible as well as intangible. So, when we are exporting the IT services, that is part of balance of payment. And most of these developed countries, they have got both balance of trade and balance of payment surplus. Now, obviously, like if you are exporting more, you'll have surplus. Then what happens is you are getting more and higher foreign exchange reserves. And because you got higher foreign exchange reserves, your economy is important. Your currency also carries a high level of value in the international market. See, today, if you want to travel anywhere, you can't travel by taking rupee around, right? You want to go to Australia, you want to go to Singapore, US. If you got US dollars, great. It's only now, it's part of, in a way, India is growing might, according to me, that if you go to Dubai, you can actually get rupee exchange. Earlier, whenever we used to go to Dubai earlier, we always has to take the local dirham currency from India rather than taking rupees, that part of it. And that because foreign exchange. Now, India, I'll come to that when you talk of LPG, but just I touch here now that the point has come up. 1988-89, we had to borrow $400 million for something, and we had to physically put gold because we had no reserves. Today, you must be proud as an Indian that we are sitting on $400 billion of forex reserves in India. That's part of how we have come up from 91 onwards. So the point I would like to appreciate is that a developed economy or economy that is developed has got a very high share or relatively high share in the global trade. Is balance of trade and balance of payment. Generally, both are positive because they are good in tangible goods as well as service sector. They import less of value-added products, and they export more of finished kind of thing. Foreign exchange reserves are strong, and obviously, as I said, their national currency has great value globally. So dollar today is an accepted currency. Today you'll find, there are reports that IMF is now considering allowing yuan, the Chinese currency, as one of the international currencies. That's part of it. In fact, olden times, people like us, we used to call dollars, sterling pound, French franc, then Deutschmark as hard currency because, for getting a dollar, you had to pay 28 rupees those days. For getting a sterling pound, we had to pay around 40, 45 rupees. So it was hard to get. Then, of course, other thing that happens is you have got a very, high rate of population growth and resultant urbanization. Now, normally, most of the developed countries are more urbanized. The population growth, there is not much. Developing countries have got a higher rate of population growth. And because the basic facilities are not available in the Mofussil area, people try to migrate. And so you'll find that India, Delhi, for example, Delhi is the whole city of migrants. Bombay, a lot of migration. Pune, Hyderabad, Chennai, Bangalore. You'll find a lot of people from other areas coming. And normally, because the population is growing and they are not getting enough avenues for employment and income generation in their own areas, they try to move where they can get avenues. Like the logic is same. Like, in India, if I'm an engineer or MBA, I can get a job. But if I want to have a higher kind of thing, I move over. So in a way, globalization is also part of population. I'll come to that down the line. Keep that aside. So urbanization is where the India, Maharashtra, almost 40% population is getting urbanized. So that's another issue. Most of the developed countries have less of rural population, more of urban population. And then, of course, you'll also find that the people in the developed countries are relatively better qualified, better educated, and therefore they are known as human capital. In India, we only used to say that India, we are having a population problem, demographic. Now we are talking of demographic dividend. And because the population growth is higher, the economy, even if it is growing, it is shared by more. So in India, we always used to have a growth of roughly around 2 to 2.5% of GDP. It's only, after 1991 that we have started talking about a GDP growth of 8%. Last 1.5 years is slightly low because of different reasons. But earlier, population growth, it also affects the economic development. And the quality of human capital relatively is less among the developed countries. In fact, most of them are more laborers and not the higher level of decision makers. Then, of course, you'll also find that because this population is higher, population growth is higher, and there's not much of value additional or value addition activities, people don't get employment. And therefore, there's a high degree or high level of unemployment in developing countries. We'll normally find that in India, for example, agriculture, although it accounts for 19%, 20% of GDP, it accounts for almost 40-45%. Agriculture, although we say that 40-45% people are 40-45% people are employed, there's something known as hidden employment or unemployment because these people are not working 6 to 8 hours a day normally around the year. You work, sowing season you work, cropping season you work, but 365, 24 by 8 you are not working. That's what happens. So there's huge degree of employment only in urban areas, unemployment across the country. Even occupation you find more into labor intensive, relatively less people into the knowledge or service sector part of it. So these are, all typical kinds of what I say parameters that we look forward to. And what happens is, if I want to develop as an economy, I want to create wealth, I want people to be wealthy, I want the quality of life to move up, I want my economic transformation from agriculture to industry to service sector, then I initiate certain measures. But these measures are basically pertaining to economy. So rather than discussing about the LPG, which I'll do in the next session, I thought I'll just touch upon the basic concepts of economy. And if you compare this, then you will find that you have got relatively better infrastructure, relatively better both hardware as well as software infrastructure. Our exports are relatively growing, and today we are exporting more from the service sector rather than the primary products kind of thing. We've got reasonably good foreign exchange reserves. So today, we can reasonably say that we are moving from underdeveloped or a developing economy to what the term is emerging economies. And India today is among the top 5 economies in the world. And which is emerging means, the future markets are going to be, and future development is going to be in countries like India. We also have a group known as BRICS. Basically Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So these are known as emerging markets because the future economic activity and markets are going to be these countries. And therefore, India realized that if you have to come out of this, break the vicious cycle of poverty, and to move into the virtuous cycle of prosperity, we need, or we were required to do something about the economy, change economic policies, change the way of looking at private sector, public sector, change the way we look at the ownership or profit. And all these measures were taken in 1991 that we'll discuss in the next session known as LPG. So till that time, let me take a break now. Basically, what I have done is I have discussed the basic parameters or concept of economy. And you will find that when I talk next time, I'll be taking off from here and moving over to the LPG part of it. I think I got a minute or so. If you got any questions, you can shoot. Otherwise, we'll take a break and we'll start our next session. Adnan, after 15 minutes, what do you say?
Yes, sir. 15 minutes sounds good.
Okay, so we'll take a break for 15 minutes. So till that time, enjoy, and we'll start with LPG. I hope I'm not moving very fast, and whatever I have said is clear, and you got the presentations also, so you can take that up. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
We'll take a break. Right on.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. 15 minutes, right? Just like industry, infrastructure, hardware, hard, soft, population. Now, what was happening was, as I said, right from 1947, because we were a poor country, we didn't have much of capital. The government, as some of you might be aware, has been taking a very active role from 1956. 1951, we started with the policy of economic planning. And 1956, actually, government made it very clear that major thrust for economic development will be coming from the government, public sector, as you call it. There's something known as, 1951 Industrial Development Regulations, 1948 also. And 1956, we adopted a model which is known as the Russian, or what we call socialist model. I won't call it communist, but it was known as a socialist model, okay? And out there, the major role was to the public sector. So if you want roads, government will do it. If you want steel, the government will produce. So the steel authority will be there. If you want bank, the banks will be, like State Bank will be there, okay? If you want telephones, again government. If you want TV, again government. So basically, most of the development was happening in the government sector, public sector. And the private sector was not really allowed to grow. They were not closed. So, Tata Steel was allowed to grow. But new steel company will not be allowed to be set up by the Tatas because, because of the socialist hangover, if I may use the word, it was felt that the private industrialists will exploit India. will develop themselves rather than the country. And those days, today we might laugh at it, but those days profit was considered to be a dirty word. So if you are earning profits, that means you are exploiting. It was very straight jacket kind of thing. And then, as you know, what happens is the moment there's more and more of public sector, one of the things that happens is the resources. I'm talking from the economics and managerial point of view. The resources are not really optimally utilized. Nobody is bothered whether you are getting the output from the money that you are putting in, because as you say, I mean, if I may use the slang, and you'll permit me for that, किसी के बाप का पैसा है, like railways, ये जनता की मतलब everybody, and everybody's property is nobody's property. So the investment was made, and you will find that if you observe, most of these public sector units were actually incurring losses rather than earning profits. So what was happening was that government was pumping in money, but the government was not getting any returns. And because it's government could afford it. So what do? You don't have money, so you print it. You print it means more money will come into circulation. So more money coming in circulation, all of you know, it leads to inflation. Inflation, the prices go up, productivity doesn't go up, efficiency doesn't go up, and you obviously cannot allow this to go on indefinitely. So government spending or government expenditure was going on. The gap between the revenues of the government and the expenditure was increasing. Plus, because of the socialist hangover and the political compulsions, I would say, they're all relative. What is good today may not be good at that point of time. So because of political compulsions of the time, relatively speaking, a lot of subsidies were happening. Like, Bombay, for example, if you're from Bombay, if you travel one way, let us say, it will cost you 20 rupees from, say, Borivali to Churchill. But if you take a monthly pass, it will hardly cost you 50 rupees. But just imagine you are traveling on 25 days, 50 times, which actually should be 50 into 20, and you are paying 50 kind of thing. That was a kind of what you call subsidization that happened. Again, subsidization at the cost of the government. So economic activity was not growing, tax revenues were not growing, taxation was quite high. Some of you may not believe this, but trust me, age has some advantage. So let me share that with you. There was a time in India when if you are earning beyond a particular, what you call super rich, as you call it, uber rich as you call it, then if you are earning 100 rupees, out of that 98 rupees will be taken by the government as part of income tax. I mean, there are a lot of black money, which is parallel economy as we call it, and plus political compulsions, money distribution, loan melas as we call it. 10,000 people will come, and that time the minister, Mr. Janardhan Pujari, will announce that they have been sanctioned a loan of 20,000 each. Recovery and other things were not consideration. Politics, as I said, and as you know, good politics is bad economics. But it went on. And then, 1977, for the first time, we had a non-Congress government at the center. Then again, 1980, Mrs. Indira Gandhi came back. 1984, again, Rajiv Gandhi came. 1988, 89 onwards, India started what is known as the political turmoil. Two governments. We had Mr. Chandrasekhar, we had Mr. Gujral, we had Mr. Devgowda, we had Mr. Charan, a number of them. And that
VP Singh also.
VP Singh also, yes. In fact, the whole social turmoil started from VP Singh, which was perpetuated and ultimately resulted in. But let me also, put one thing on the record. Actually, it was Mr. VP Singh who introduced some of the basic economic reforms way back in 1984-85. You must give him that credit also.
Absolutely.
That apart, so as I said, economy started sliding down. It was critical. And as I mentioned in my earlier session, in 1988, see, India, one thing you must give kudos for India is that we have never defaulted as a country on any of our foreign payment commitments. And 1988, we had to pay a sum of something like 400 million. Sorry?
No,
Can
sir.
I continue?
Continue, sir.
Okay.
Yes, please.
So as I was saying, in 1988-89, when Mr. Chandrasekhar was the Prime Minister, we had to pay something like 400 million. If you go by even today's rate, that $400 million would roughly be about 2,800 crores. That time, the rate was also much lower, around 18 rupees. So it was much, but no country in the world or no institution in the world was willing to give us the loan, even at the commercial rate, which is known as the external commercial rate, ACB, external commercial borrowing, as we call it in the international finance. Nobody was willing to give us at that high rate also. And for the first time, India had to deposit gold from Reserve Bank of India Treasury into Bank of England. And again, that 400 million worth of gold, Bank of Japan gave us a loan of 400 million. It was, it was that bad. We were actually, if I may use the word, economic pariah, as you call it, untouchable. And then 91, we had again one of the major political calamity where a would-be Prime Minister was assassinated, 20th or 21st of May 1991. And then Mr. Rao took over. It was a minority government again. And then the IMF and the World Bank came out very clearly that if you continue the way you are continuing, India would be going down the drain only. So you must do something for the financial and economic policies of the government, of the industrial policy, of the banking policy, of the both monetary and fiscal policies, as we call it. And then it was out of this compulsion laid down, or what is known as conditionalities laid by the World Bank, that the Indian government had to adopt what is known as the policies of liberalization, privatization, globalization, 1991. Mr. Rao happened to be the Prime Minister, and Dr. Manmohan Singh was brought in, who was earlier a typical bureaucrat and RBI governor also, if you are aware of it. He was brought in, as a finance minister because he had good contact with the World Bank and the IMF, and we needed money badly. So it was basically because of this economic turmoil and economic compulsions that the Indian government had to initiate the policies of liberalization, globalization, LPG as we call it. If you want to give credit, I have no issues, but basically it was the economic compulsion of 1991 that we went for this LPG policies. Now this is a quick, what you call, recap of what India, we had to go for the policies of liberalization, private and globalization, which is also known as the policy of structural adjustment and stabilization, as technically World Bank they call it. Okay, so these policies basically known as liberalization measures, macroeconomic reforms, and as I said, structural adjustment. Structure means what? Indian economy predominantly public sector, everything into government, private sector lower play. Now you are changing the very structure. That means the public sector will be relatively marginalized and more importance will be given to the private sector. That was the basically structural adjustment that we'll be talking about as we go along. Are you clear about the what you call the necessity or compulsion of economic reforms quickly?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now let us move over. Broadly, they were into industrial policy, trade policy. These were the policies which were first taken up for reforms. Then we had banking policy also, insurance also, retail, FDI, foreign trade, everything was taken up. We will go through this one by one, but just
And the
look at
license Raj also, sir.
License Raj. In fact, I'm going to see license Raj was associated with industry. Okay, fine. Let me just before I move. Now, typically, just bear with me. I'll come to that. Licensing also. But typically, what happened was, as I said, these were the compulsions or conditions laid down by the World Bank and IMF. Now, on the screen, you will be able to see what is known as the IMF and the IBRD conditionality. That is, they said if you want us to help you out of this morass and put you on the right track so that you are not further derailed, you got to follow certain policies. Now, what are those policies? They said first was reduction of fiscal deficit. Deficit means, see, if you are a government, you can afford to spend more than you earn. If you are an individual like us, individually, if you spend more, you become bankrupt. When I was working State Bank, I was in Gujarat. And in Gujarat, there is a saying that, if Lord Krishna does it, he marries 18, nothing religious, don't get me wrong. If he marries 18, 20,000 girls, that is fine. That is Bhagwan ki Leela. But if you and me try to do something like this, that is known as affair kind of thing. So government deficit on the individual part, it is known as bankruptcy. So typically RBI and the government were told in no uncertain terms that boss, what you have to do is you have to reduce the fiscal deficit, particularly fiscal policies are handled by the government and monetary policies are handled by the RBI. The RBI governor is in charge of monetary policies and the finance minister is in charge of fiscal policy. So first thing that they said that boss, you have to reduce fiscal deficit. You can't keep on spending money when you don't have it and control deficit. In fact, some of you might be aware that down the line, not in 91, but down the line actually we have passed a bill when Mr. Chidambaram was the finance minister, which actually laid down that the fiscal deficit will not be more than 4.5% of the GDP. That was at the instance of
FRBM Act.
Correct, absolutely.
FRBM Act 2003.
Absolutely. Okay. So I'm not going to those details right now. I'll come back to this. I'm just giving a generic kind of discussion. Okay. So first was reduction of fiscal deficit. Again, World Bank, IMF condition. Second, they said it's high time you reform your tax system. By all means, you must get money, but 98 and 70% is not something that you extract. So they said that you will have to bring down the tax slabs, as you call it. Plus, if I may add, we'll talk about it slightly later. In India, you will find that direct taxes are relatively less and indirect taxes are more. So whether you are earning 100 rupees or 1,000 or 1 lakh of rupees, if you are earning 10,000 rupees and you are purchasing a petrol and I am earning 1 lakh rupees and I am purchasing petrol, both of us pay the same taxes on indirect taxes on petrol. So in India, it was more indirect taxes. They said, boss, you have to change you have to reform your tax system. More people have to be brought into the tax net and you have to move more from indirect taxes to direct part of the reforms. A lot of committees were appointed. I will touch upon them down the line. Okay. Then they also said that interest rates, earlier, the interest rates were laid down by the RBI. So how much you can pay on savings account, 4%, RBI will tell. If you are having a deposit, fixed deposit for 1 year, RBI says, okay, you pay 8%. If it is 2 years, you pay 8.5. 3 years, you pay 9%. 5 years, you pay 8.75%. So all these rates on deposits as well as loans, please remember this also, were actually fixed by the RBI. So if I want a loan of 1 lakh, RBI will decide. I want a loan of 1 crore, RBI will decide. If the bank wants to give loan to a farmer, RBI will decide. If the bank wants to give loan to a small scale entrepreneur, RBI will. So these rates were actually fixed or what you call regulated and directed by the RBI. One of the things that was brought in was these interest rates, excluding saving bank at that point of time, were what is known as deregulated. Remember this term. Deregulated means, the RBI will not decide how much interest you pay on deposits or how much interest you charge on loan. The individual banks were allowed to decide their own interest rates on FD. Now, even saving, you'll find, Yes Bank is not a good name or good example, but Yes Bank was probably the first bank who started offering 6% recently when the interest rates on savings also were deregulated. So the point I would like to remember is that the interest rates were deregulated. That means the banks were given the autonomy to decide the interest rate both on deposits as well as advances. Then another thing that was laid down was the government had to control inflation and deficit finance. Now, as I said, what happens if there's inflation? More money comes in. More money comes in, automatically prices go up. So prices go up, if I'm working, I will expect higher DNS allowance. So salaries go up. That means as an industry, my cost goes up. Cost goes up, I become less cost competitive. So inflation has to be controlled. Now, also, let me clarify, inflation should not be zero. It should be in what you call around 3 to 4%. If it goes beyond 8, 9, 10 and double digit, then there are problems with inflation. I'll touch upon this inflation topic later on. Basically, they said that unwarranted or uncontrolled price level, rise in the price level. I repeat, inflation is not rise in prices of individual products. So if the gold price, like it moved sometime back to say 42,000 or 45,000, it is not inflation. If the petrol moves from 90 rupees to 92 rupees, it is not inflation. That is price rise. Inflation is where, there's something known as index, consumer price index or wholesale price index, that moves. So increase in price level is inflation. They said you must control the inflation level also. Then they said there has to be increase in the tax and GDP ratio. More tax has to be collected because there are people who are earning money but who are not paying the taxes. So you must reform the tax system so that people who are evading taxes are brought in, plus people are made to pay reasonable taxes, not 98 or 70%. So you'll find that normally, over the few years, now the tax structure is about 30% more or less. 70% I keep, 30% I give, I have no issues. Then they also said that rupee had to be devalued. Devalued means, see, today you go to market, the rates are determined in the market, but government earlier, the government will fix that $1 will be equal to 28 rupees. But because the rupee was not strong and Indian economy was weak, there was something known as Hawala racket. So in the unofficial market, we used to get 31 rupees for a dollar. Like, I'm working abroad and I want to send money to India. Now, if I send it through the banking channels, say $1,000, so that 1,000 rupees, $1,000 will be converted in India at the rate of 28. But then what happens, somebody will come and contact me in the US and say, boss, we will deliver this money in rupee at your home within 24 hours. It is known as Hawala racket. I mean, most of this money was used for undesirable, like smuggling, as we used to call it. Today, the word smuggling is almost gone. Please remember this. So rupee had to be devalued. Market rates will prevail and government will not control. So today you'll find, that rupee could be 65 rupees. It could be 63 also. It can be 68 also. That time 28 means 28. So that was another restriction. Then they also said that once you devalue rupee, it will be floating in the market and it will be market rate related floating exchange rate. So if the market want more dollars and less rupees, you will have to pay more rupees for a dollar. But if the rupee is strong, then you have to pay less. So basically market related. Then they also said that because the government is spending more and you have to ultimately balance. So government was raising a lot of money from market, known as government borrowing, the public loans or public debt. They said the government has to follow prudential behavior. They cannot go on borrowing. So there was a restriction on the borrowings of the government, because if you borrow, you have to pay interest. And those days there were occasions where 27 to 30% of the money that the government was earning was being given for interest. In fact, there were certain occasions where the government had to borrow to pay the interest, which was, very critical kind of thing. So the IMF and World Bank said, boss, you have to control the government borrowing because, you simply don't have that repayment capacity over a long period. Then they also said cut down subsidies. Like, recently, I don't know how many of your parents have cut it down, but, if you have a gas cylinder, every gas cylinder, you are getting a subsidy. So practically power, you are getting a subsidy. Fertilizers, you are getting a subsidy. And this amount individually might be less, but you are running into thousands of crores of rupees, which again, the government was not able to sustain. So the IMF and the World Bank said, IBRD is the official name, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We normally call it World Bank. So I'm using the word World Bank, not IBRD. So they said cut down subsidies. Again, it was a direction. They also said that, you got a very protected kind of regime of imports and exports. So you must open up the economy. That is where the liberalization comes in. You must open up the economy. You must allow a lot of imports to come into your country. So that is what is known as liberalization of international trade policy. Today, you'll find people are not crazy. In fact, today somebody is coming from abroad and they ask you, I mean, what do you want me to bring? He says, "Vadu, aja." Because today, practically most of you are aware, everything available globally is available in India. If something new is there, it is flight in the next flight. The first flight comes to India, it is available in India. So today, any product across the world is available in India. Olden time, it was not there because there are a lot of restrictions on the import part of it. So the World Bank and IMF said that government of India has to remove a lot of restrictions, and that is where the trade policy reforms came in, which we'll touch upon later. Then they also said this investment, basically what they said, the government need not be into business, but if you want to be in business, so State Bank need not be owned 100% by the government. Bank of India need not be owned 100%. The government can own 60%, 40% can be sold off into market, so that the government gets money out of that 40%. To that extent, the government deficit could be low. So they insisted on the policy of what we call disinvestment. Okay, before I move, just a small clarification. Disinvestment is where the government continues to have the control and management of the unit. But like I just said, State Bank, 60% control with the government, 40%, with private, shareholders and private institutes. There's another term that is used known as divestment, where the government actually sells off the ownership and passes it on to the private sector. Like you heard of VSNL. The VSNL earlier was government, now it is owned by Tata. So that is disinvestment. Or if you go to Bombay, Santa Cruz Airport, there is a hotel, that Sahara Star Hotel. That was actually owned by Air India. That has been sold off to private. So that is divestment. They said you must go for disinvestment and divestment. Basically, idea was that the government should try to have a minimum role in the business, and more should be opened up for the private sector. So disinvestment and divestment, as we call it. Now, the earlier question that was asked, if I may summarize the whole LPG, paradigm shift. If you look at the screen, I have just given, there are 2 slides that we'll quickly run through, and then I'll come back for explanation if time permits. Basically, what has happened because of this 91 policy is that we have moved from control to decontrol. We have moved from regulation to deregulation. We have moved, as one of you were asking, we have moved from license to de-license. We have moved from we have moved from sellers market to buyers market. We have moved from public sector dominance to what we call the private sector initiative or entry. We have also moved from production to marketing, then from product to customer, then from supply to demand, volume to profit. Viability is now more important. Then sales to satisfaction. I'll elaborate this further when I come back for explanation. Then from internal to external, strategic management and all those things have become a root feature in management now. Now, let us come back. Control, regulation and licensing means, as I said, there was this 1948 Act. Then we had 1951 Act and 1956 Industrial Policy, where the government will decide who will start what. The government will decide how much investment could be made. The government will decide who will be allowed to make investment. So if the government thinks Tatas and Birlas are rich, if your assets are more than 50 crores, government say Tatas and Birlas not allowed. So people who had money and ability to create wealth were not allowed. Actually, it did not create a lot of avenues of income and revenue generation. So licensing. Olden times, if you want to start something, Bajaj, auto license. Today, Maruti, for example, Maruti could get it cleared because it was a dream of Sanjay Gandhi, who happened to be the son of the then Prime Minister. Today, if you want to start any industry, except 3 core sectors, all the license, regulation, controls have been removed. That's why new private sector entrepreneurial startup culture has started coming in. So we have moved from control to decontrol, regulation to deregulation, licensing to delicensing. Earlier, there was always a monopoly. So telephones, only BSNL. Or corporate, metropolitan cities, MTNL. If you want life insurance, it was only the LIC. If there's a transportation, only airlines, Indian Airlines. Or if you want to go abroad, Air India. Even today, the government people have to travel by Air India. That was the kind of monopoly. That time you had no choice. If you want a two-wheeler, if you want to have a motorbike, Royal Enfield or Java, if you want a scooter, Bajaj. Hamara Bajaj, as we used to call it that time. It was basically monopoly. Now you'll find, and because it's monopoly, it was a seller's market. So some of you may not believe this, but believe because we have grown with it. You had to book a TV, you had to book a refrigerator, you had to book a scooter. In fact, the waiting time for scooter was anywhere between 5 to 7 years because there was control. So only Bajaj will be allowed to manufacture 5 lakh scooters. The demand might be there for 15 lakhs, 12 lakhs. You wait for 3, 4, 5 years till the time Bajaj gives. So now that monopoly controls regulation has now gone. We have moved from monopoly to competition. See, today if you go to market, you don't have to wait. You select the color, you select the package also, you select the bank also. Then we have moved from protection to opening up. Foreign companies were not allowed. Today you'll find a lot of foreign players are there. So that is where we have moved from protection to opening up. Again, it is part of internal as well as the export-import policy also. Most important, we have moved from supply to demand and sellers market to buyers market. That is why you are talking about marketing. Selling means what? Look, I got this Bajaj scooter, okay? This scooter, it will not give you more than 42 kilometers. The color is what you get in this lot. Today what happens is you get a color, you get a choice, you get a package, you get a financial package also. That is because we have moved from a seller's market to buyer's market. That's where the marketing comes in, because market is competition, and that is something that was not available earlier. So supply to demand, sellers to buyers, and then of course, as I said, BSNL. Now I'm really doubtful whether a lot of you people have got a BSNL mobile, and that is because older time it was monopoly and therefore dominance. Today, if I want to travel by bus, not that we travel much, but if you want to travel by bus, I doubt how many of you will travel by state transport or Nita and Purple and those kind of things. Or even if by airlines you want to travel, very few will go by Air India. More people are going by Indigo or Spice or Go Air. That is where you have moved from a public sector dominance to private sector. Again, this is part of post 1991 LPG paradigm shift. Then, if you look at it, you'll find that we have moved from production to marketing. So, as I said, I produce 5 lakh units and there are 20 lakh people waiting. So obviously, I'm not bothered about marketing part of it. Like, I remember LIC had created a position of marketing, and what they were dealing is basically walk-in business only. I will not go and reach out and convince people. Selling is this what I have. If you want, take it. If you don't want, thank you so much. Marketing is where, what you call, if you heard of Henry Ford? No, there's a very beautiful, the production and sellers market orientation. There's a beautiful quote by Henry Ford where he used to say, my customers can have any color of the car as long as it is black. Today, if somebody say that, you say blackout, I want blue, if you're getting blue, thank you so much. So we have moved from that production to marketing. We have moved from product to customer driven, customer focused and customer centric, as we call it. We also moved from supply to demand. We also moved from volume to profit, because profit is a survival condition. Viability is most important, because the moment you start losing, you are not making use which is optimal of the resources, which is criminal in a country like India. Then from sales to satisfaction, in fact, some of you might be aware that we are moving from sales to satisfaction to delight and love. Or in marketing, some of you must have studied, we are moving from suspect to prospect to client to advocate and partner. Have you done this? Suspect, prospect, client, advocate. Have you studied customer delight? Okay.
I don't think so, sir.
That is CRM. Okay, we also moved from internal to external, and we have moved from existing market to future markets, long-term perspective basically. Now, before we close today's session, let me just give you the background of why this particular policy was adopted by the government of India. And because we have 2 minutes, I'll just quickly quote from the Government of India, a discussion paper which was brought on in July 1993. And as I said, I'll summarize the LPG goal by quoting from the discussion paper on economic reforms brought out by the Ministry of Finance in July 93. I'll discuss this in detail in the next session, mostly tomorrow. But before we close today, a quick recap. The government policy paper said, why was it required? Basically, to bring about rapid and sustained improvement in the quality of people of India. Central to this goal is the rapid growth in income and productive employment. Then, successful and sustained development depends on continuing increases in the productivity of our capital, our land, and our labor. Within a generation, the countries of East Asia, Southeast Asia, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore. Within a generation, the countries of East Asia have transformed themselves. China, Indonesia, Korea, Thailand, and Malaysia today have living standards much above ours. What they have achieved, we must strive for. So this was the basic purpose, economic development, and taking the fruits of economic development, as you know, what is known as the grassroots penetration kind of thing. So this was the basic purpose why the policy was initiated, which is popularly known as LPG policy. The details of this LPG and what is meant by this specific term is something that we will discuss tomorrow. Thank you so much for being with me today. Thank you and bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.
Thank you,
Antaran,
sir.
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.